Good morning. So we are now going to start our BIREC webinar. Welcome. Delighted to see such a global audience tuned in. We will be conducting this audience in English to accommodate for the globalism that is renewable energy. My name is Rosa Ellswood. I am the director of BIREC. BIREC is taking place from the 27th till the 29th of November in the Tivoli Hotel in Sao Paulo. It is 200 senior level decision makers conducting business over 3 days of high quality and exclusive networking opportunities in an intimate setting. It is the only BIREC is the only finance and investment driven senior level conference uniting international and local stakeholders in the Brazilian renewable energy market. BIREC brings all stages of Brazil's renewable energy value chain under one roof, from government and policy to finance and solution providers. Today I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar alongside our partners CELA, Clean Energy Latin America. For our webinar today, Financing Brazil's Renewable Energy Future, I would like to welcome our moderator Camila Ramos and our two speakers Eduardo Klepacz and Pedro, Araújo, Mateus. So introducing Camila. Camila Ramos is Managing Director and founder of CELA, Clean Energy Latin America. She has over 15 years of experience in the renewable energy sector in Latin America, including bioenergy, wind and solar PV. Before CELA, Camila was Country Manager and Head of Latin American Research at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, where she supported clients with research and analysis of renewable energy sectors and markets, as well as trends in the region. She was also Marketing and Communications Manager at ERB, Energias Renováveis do Brasil. She also worked as consultant at PricewaterhouseCoopers, focusing in agribusiness, and coordinated Infinity Bioenergy's research department in Brazil. Camila has an MSc and BSc from the London School of Economics and Political Science, also known as LSE. Camila is also advisory board member at Solar, the Brazilian PV Industry Association, as well as being on the advisory board at LACOR, Latin American and Caribbean Council on Renewable Energy. She's also an advisory board member at the Inter-American Clean Energy Institute and a finance expert at the Clean Energy Finance Solutions Center. She is the Brazil contributor for REN21, Renewable Energy Network for the 21st Century. I'm delighted to welcome you, Camila. Before I pass you over, I just want to say a couple of things about our panelists. So Eduardo Klepacz is a Managing Director of GTIS and is the head of the firm's Brazil infrastructure business. Mr. Klepacz has more than 10 years of experience in infrastructure investment. For the 3 years prior to joining GTIS, Mr. Klepacz was instrumental in the creation of Cubico Sustainable Investment, or Cubico, where he acted as CEO of Brazil, managing a portfolio of renewable energy projects with $350 million in equity investments, that's 620 megawatts, and led a team of more than 90 employees. During this period, Mr. Klepacz closed one of the most notable transactions in the sector, the acquisition of a $620 million portfolio of wind projects from Casa dos Ventos. While at Cubico, he was also a member of the Global Investment and Global Risk, HSE committees. Cubico is a global renewable energy company with more than 2.4 gigawatts of installed capacity across 8 countries. Pedro Mateus, this is our third and final panelist, is CFO of Faro Energy, an investment company with focus on solar DG in Latin America, with offices in London, Sao Paulo and Colombia. He joined Faro after his role as finance executive at Renewable Energy, the largest Brazilian wind IPP. Previously, he was investment director at Rio Forte Brazil, an investment holding with 3 billion euros of assets under management, having board positions in renewable energy and agribusiness invested companies, where he also established the FP&A area in South America. Pedro was a director at Eco Progresso, deeply involved in the creation and investment of the first Portuguese carbon fund, Luso Carbon Fund, leading successful investments in Brazil and China, consolidating in this way the experience acquired in the Environmental Protection Agency, where he was responsible for the implementation of emissions trading in Portugal. In Pedro's professional experience, he's conducted equity investments totaling 300 million euros from both the buy and sell side. So welcome Camila, Eduardo and Pedro. Camila, I'm now going to hand over to you to say a few opening words, and I believe you're also going to give a presentation.
Thank you, Rosa, for the introduction. Can you see my screen?
I'm just sharing my screen with you now, Camila.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, it looks great.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone listening to this webinar today. First of all, I'd like to thank Green Power Global for the invitation to participate in this webinar, and to thank Eduardo, Klepacz from GTIS Partners and Pedro Mateus from Faro Energy for being part of this discussion. My name is Camila Ramos. I'm Managing Director at CELA Clean Energy Latin America, and it is with great pleasure that I start this webinar today, when we can have a chance to discuss financing Brazil's renewable energy future in preparation for BIREC, which will be held in São Paulo in late November. CELA is a partner at BIREC and will participate in a few panels there at the Congress in November, including a workshop during the morning of the last day of the Congress, where CELA will officially launch a new and exciting digital product to evaluate the economic feasibility of renewable energy projects in Brazil. So CELA Clean Energy Latin America is a São Paulo-based financial advisory consulting firm supporting renewable energy companies and investors in Latin America. Our main services include investment strategy and consulting, business plans, especially for companies entering the Brazilian distributed generation segment, equity fundraising and M&A, where CELA has advised clients on the sale of more than 700 megawatts of projects, project finance, where CELA has supported clients in financing over 1.5 billion reais in projects, financial modeling for renewable energy auctions and free markets, and finally, financial due diligence of projects. CELA's focus has always been exclusively on wind, solar, and the bioenergy segment. CELA's clients range from Brazilian to global companies active in renewable energy in Latin America, in the global solar PV, wind, and bioenergy segments, from investors, project developers, equipment manufacturers, to governments and multilateral agencies. I always like to start this type of discussion by showing Bloomberg New Energy Finance New Energy Outlook graph, which you can see there. It estimates Brazil power matrix in 2040. It expects solar PV to represent 32% of Brazil's power matrix by 2040, with 126 gigawatts. And just to put in perspective, solar today represents less than 1% of the Brazilian power matrix. It expects winds to represent 12% with 48 gigawatts of installed capacity, and bioenergy to represent 9% with 36 gigawatts. This means an additional 180 gigawatts of renewable energy projects to be built in the country by 2040, of which an additional 124.5 gigawatts from solar PV, both utility scale and distributed generation, an additional 34.7 gigawatts from wind, and an additional 21.3 gigawatts from biomass, which translates to more than 8 gigawatts per year of additional renewable energy capacity. It will involve approximately $155 billion in investments in renewable energy projects in the period, which represents a unique opportunity, but also great challenges. One small addendum: utility scale solar has grown from 0 megawatts to 1.3 gigawatts of installed capacity in just 2 years, and solar distributed generation has reached 400 megawatts this month. Half of these 400 megawatts from distributed generation were installed in 2018 alone, and this year has not ended yet. So our first topic for discussion that our speakers will discuss today is what are the challenges and opportunities in a scenario of a smaller and fewer renewable energy auctions, but also an expanding free market for utility scale projects. I'll kick this discussion off by saying that renewable energy auctions have been the driver of renewable energy growth in Brazil since the early 2000s, when there were practically no wind or solar projects in the country. An average 1.5 to 2 gigawatts approximately of new renewable energy projects, so wind and solar, were contracted in these auctions every year since 2008. And investors and developers have counted on a yearly basis on these long-term inflation-adjusted and government-backed PPAs between generators and utilities as the source of demand for renewable energy projects in the country. Since 2016, Brazil has been conducting less and less auctions, contracting less projects, and as a result of a long and complex discussion involving Brazil's power supply and demand balance, Brazil's economy slowed down, and increased auction for thermoelectric fossil fuel plants, which are seen by some as baseload power as opposed to renewables intermittency, and among other reasons. However, since the beginning of 2018, Brazil has seen an increased free market activity, mostly in two fronts. So renewable energy projects that participate and sell in the auctions have been selling less of the available energy of these projects that secure these PPA in auctions, and separating an increasing part of that energy that these projects produce to be sold in the free market, as a result of the lower prices being practiced in the more competitive auctions. The latest auction contracted wind at approximately $21 per megawatt hour and solar PV at approximately $35 per megawatt hour. These prices have been possible in Brazil as a result of the quality of the solar and wind resources in the country. And secondly, renewable energy projects contracted exclusively in the free market. Some projects have signed this PPA as a result of auctions organized by buyers, such as by utilities themselves, such as CEMIG, which has contracted 1.2 gigawatts in an auction it held this year and will hold another one in a few days, and even auctions organized by the sellers themselves. So an example, an auction held by Casa dos Ventos, a Brazilian wind developer, last month. It is worth mentioning that the market has accommodated in an efficient way a new way of contracting renewable energy projects in the country through the free market as a result of the competitiveness of unsubsidized wind and solar here in Brazil. The free market could potentially offer new opportunities for renewable energy in Brazil, such as better PPA prices potentially, and a slowdown in the race to ever lower PPA prices as buyers and sellers negotiate directly and not through auctions. Also, PPAs possibly in foreign currency and therefore opportunity to finance projects in US dollars, for example. Again, it will be important to analyze the risks involved in these free market PPAs, their conditions, offtake risks, terms of the contracts, etc. But this could be a sign of a maturing market for renewable energy. It would be great to hear more about this from Eduardo Klepacz, his views on the challenges and opportunities brought by less auctions but also an expanding free market. This is a global trend. So according to this figure by IRENA, corporations represent 2/3 of the world's energy consumption. The countries in yellow are countries where corporate sourcing of renewable electricity has taken place either through PPAs, utility green procurement programs, and or purchase of unbundled renewable energy electricity certificates. Specifically to Brazil, only 60% of eligible corporations have already migrated to the free market, so corporations that could be buying energy in the free market. So therefore, there is a growing opportunity here. Furthermore, with the upcoming regulatory changes in Brazil that are in discussion in the country, there should be a greater opening to the free market, allowing for smaller consumers that today are not allowed to be buying electricity in the free markets to migrate as well. So the second question that we have here in this webinar, distributed generation, what challenges and opportunities do the G projects face? So distributed generation has been growing at triple-digit rates in Brazil. We are surpassing 500 megawatts probably of installed capacity this year from more than 40,000 distributed generation projects operational in the country. The vast majority of these projects have been built in 2018 alone as a result of many things, such as a regulatory framework that is conducive of the growth for distributed generation projects, where net metering, but also new business models such as virtual net metering are possible and viable throughout the entire country. Companies like Faro Energy that we hear from today from Pedro Mateus are deploying projects that are not only for residential consumers in their rooftops, but also for commercial and industrial scale consumers, from ground-mounted projects up to 5 megawatts of capacity that can still benefit from the net metering legislation in place in the country today. New business models which offer the consumer the possibility to benefit from distributed generation without having to make an investment in generation assets themselves. Added to this, the appetite of larger players that are willing to make these types of investments for the clients have been adding to the growth of this market, and increased availability of more competitive financing for distributed generation from banks such as the BNDES, BNB, and commercial banks such as Santander, BV, and others, but also green bonds, as we will hear again from Pedro Mateus, probably from Faro Energy today, which issued the first green bonds to finance Brazilian solar distributed generation projects. And also opportunities in rising power tariffs, which mean that distributed generation is viable in most of the country today, as there is no retail market in Brazil and where utilities control their concession areas. Therefore, solar is proving to be an interesting option for the consumer. In terms of challenges, we have upcoming regulatory changes, discussing the way the net metering regulation works today. So it's important that this discussion is very broad and detailed, because solar distributed generation still represents a very, very small proportion, and total solar installed capacity, even with the utility scale, representing less than 1% of the Brazilian energy matrix. So it's still a very nascent technology to be taken to be rediscussed so soon. Financing and guarantees are also challenges that the market faces, and all the difficulties and challenges that a young and new market face. And finally, the question of how utility scale energy projects being financed today in Brazil. And we will hear this more from our speakers today. As an introduction to this topic, the wind industry is a more mature sector in Brazil. Since its inception in 2007, 2008 in the country, wind projects used to be financed mostly by BNDES, then BNB, and as well, but mostly from the BNDES. And currently, as the role of the BNDES is decreasing in its mission to diversify the financing market in the country, not only for renewable energy, for all sectors, as well as bringing BNDES's cost closer to market costs. So we have been seeing more participation of corporate finance, bonds, green bonds, financing in foreign currency, etc., that are more and more common today. For solar, which made its debut in the Brazilian market much later in 2014, most projects were, and still some are financed 100% from with equity. BNDES has financed some projects, but most financing has come from the BNB, which allows for financing for local content, financing the local content of projects that have imported modules as well. So this trend should soon diversify, as the wind sector has already done, with issuing bonds and green bonds, as well as corporate finance, financing foreign currency, etc. So to conclude, I'd like to mention that the evaluation of the economic feasibility of projects and financing in Brazil can be complex and very specific to the country. So we at CELA help our clients, both Brazilian and foreign, in navigating through this analysis and financing. I will now invite our first speaker. It will be Pedro Mateus from Faro Energy to share his experience in financing renewable energy in Brazil, and then followed by Eduardo Klepacz from GTIS Partners, and then we can have some Q&A at the end. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Camila, for passing the speaker to me, and thank you also for the very nice introduction, and good morning to everyone. So Faro Energy is an investment company headquartered in London with offices in Brazil and Colombia, and our focus is to invest, originate, develop, and finance, or invest in solar DG projects across Latin America, special focus in Brazil and Colombia. As priorities and challenges we face over here is like originate quality projects and with good counterparties. Our business model develops on TPO, third-party ownership. So as Camila said, we do all the investment and we do a long-term contract with the customer that gets the energy from the solar assets. And we have, with that assumption, to build world-class projects because we take performance risks. So we only work with world-class EPC partners on a value chain that is being developed in these countries. So this is a challenge. And we also have as a big challenge and a huge priority to raise affordable capital. We know that local capital markets, they are somehow scarce and they have a high cost for the European patents, for instance. And the international capital markets, sometimes they get nervous, and Brazil is at a very good moment where the markets are a bit nervous with Brazil, and not only the local but the international markets, and they can become expensive at some point. And as a third priority we have is the asset management excellence. So Faro in the end is an asset manager, and we focus very well on developing that profile. On the left, you can see some photos of projects that we have built in Colombia and in Brazil. On the next slide, by the end of this year, we will have more than 15 megawatts in operation, and we already have a contract and a discussion, more 60 megawatts to build across 2019. As Camila also mentioned, the sector is growing very, very fast. It's a very interesting niche of market that we have at the moment. And this is making creating jobs, bringing investment, not only local but also international. So Faro doesn't have local funding at the moment, and this is something that pleases me a lot, seeing on the counter cycle of everything of the economy in Brazil, seeing a sector that is growing so fast and bringing so much investment into Brazil, for instance. We will invest until the end of the year $17 million. But this number will be 4 times bigger next year. But as I said, to keep this growth, companies like Faro, and Faro is not the only player, need a stable regulatory framework. This is fundamental for any sector, but especially for a new one as the solar DG, this is really critical. I have to say that the DG in Brazil, distributed generation in Brazil, started in 2012. But the regulation wasn't properly fitted for the market. So what happened? Nothing. There was no solar or distributed generation being installed in Brazil in those years. Until in 2015, ANEEL made a revision of this regulation and issued a 687/15, and the market started to grow. This is what made the market, this is what made a shift on the market, and this is how we have been perceiving an incredible growth of solar, even though in terms of installed capacity, it's still a small percentage of all the energy, of all the installed capacity in Brazil, but it's a very interesting growth that we've been watching. As Camila said, we just reached 400 megawatts. Here on my slide, I have 350 megawatts that was publicly announced last month. So this month, we have an addition of another 50 megawatts of installed capacity, which is amazing, right? But next year, we have another revision of the distributed generation regulation in Brazil. And of course, this creates strong uncertainties to the sector, to the investors, to the customers, to all the players that want to have a role in this market, in the solar distributed generation, or in all the other sources of energy for the distributed generation. And then here I highlighted some questions that I hear a lot in conversations, in discussions at AB Solar or in conference or with players, with customers, because indeed we just ask stability. That's what the players, the investors, the customers ask, stability and provision. So one of the things like, will now assure grandfathering of projects connected until the next revision in 2019? So if I connect a project this year, will it suffer any impact of any potential revision of the law or not? This is really important because I'm doing an investment, and it's not small investments for the scale of DG, with the assumption of the current law. If I don't know how the law will be within 2 years, how can I simulate that? Should I wait to see the new regulation? Should we stop the market? Have we already measured the real impacts of distributed generation over the electrical grid and the utilities? We do hear a lot in the sector, the utilities, some utilities or the main association of the sector of utilities, ABRAG, complaining about the impact of distributed generation in the grid. In my perception, in my humble perception, 400 or 500 megawatts, it's nothing in the end. I don't believe that there is a huge impact over the grid, but I think, first of all, we should monitor this, and any decision should be made with data. I think we can't have assumptions to change a regulation that is working so well for this sector. We have more, if I'm not wrong, according to data of AB Solar, we have more than 2,000 installers of solar in Brazil that have been created in the last 2 years. If we change the regulation, well, we might close those 2,000 companies in the end, small companies. Virtual net metering projects, today, they pay consumption demand cost. Should they be treated as a generator and pay lower demand costs? So this is a huge difference. As Camila said, on distributed generation, you can do on-site projects, solar, wind, whatever technology on renewable or cogeneration, qualified cogeneration, up to 5 megawatts. But you can also do within the same utility grid projects up to 5 megawatts, which are called virtual net metering projects. And these projects, when they are not on-site, they pay demand to the grid. They pay a full demand, consumption demand to the utility. When Eduardo, for instance, connects a huge wind farm or a huge utility project of solar, they pay generator demand and with a benefit of 50% over there. So I don't think this is really balanced at the moment, and this probably should be a point to be addressed under this revision of the regulation also, I hope. Will utilities face penalties when they don't fulfill the DG regulations? One of the good things of this regulation of 587 or 687 in 2015 was that established deadlines for utilities to give connection permits, to give information about the connection, to reply to customers with specific timelines following a rule on that. We understand that the utilities are also adapting to this market. The growth has been very aggressive within some regions and with a huge impact for some utilities. But what happens when the utility doesn't reply to you on time? What happens when you cannot connect to your system and you have to wait 4, 5, 6 months for that? At the moment, the only impact is over the investor or over the customer. What is the real impact for distributed generation that is more focused on low-tension consumers of the binomial tariff? This is a huge question, and I think we could have a webinar only for this point. And then, just to finish, and then these questions I'm putting over here just for us brainstorm, and I would love to hear more from the attendees. Should we shift the peak time in Brazil? Today, peak time is the concession has to pick up 3 hours between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. if I'm not wrong, and it's mainly at night. CCE and OMS are showing data that the peak time today is shifting in several concessions in several points of Brazil to the between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. Should we shift the peak time in Brazil or not? This will also have a huge impact on distributed generation and mainly solar. And to finish, on this last slide, I made the overview from the client perspective. So how are distributed generation projects being financed in Brazil? And on customers, we have residential customers, small systems, and then we have CNI, so commercial and industrial customers, bigger systems. On the residential sector, most of the systems that are being installed today at a huge pace, they are financed by own equity of the owner of the house. So basically, he makes an assessment of the benefit he will get on generating his own energy versus paying the energy to the utility, versus having that cash on a savings account, getting the benefit of the interest rate. This is the math that he makes in the end. And most of the resi systems are coming from equity, own cash of homeowners, and commercial banks. So Santander, Banco Votorantim, and others have specific lines for solar systems with interest rates that can go above 20% per year, but that's the reality in Brazil for commercial banks. That's more or less also the same interest rate for buying a car. So in the end, for local patents, it's a competitive interest rate, and commercial banks are lending money for resi systems. In the end, some of the resi also, bigger systems are also going to development banks, and here I would say mainly FCOs and BNB, more in the northeast of the country, but the impact is smaller than commercial banks, in my opinion. And then in the end, investment companies like Faro Energy, I at least in my knowledge, I don't know any investment company that is doing TPO for resi systems in Brazil, and Faro doesn't do it, for instance, also. Then we go to the CNI customers, and for the CNI customers, bigger systems, a small portion of those customers do with their own equity. There are plenty of solutions for them to generate their own energy, either with solar, small hydros, wind, and only a small portion buy the system with own equity, or doing a loan on a commercial bank. For those credit lines and that equity, they save it for their business in the end. They do go for commercial, for development banks. So BNB is very active with CNI customers on doing finance for DG systems. And then companies like Faro that do all the investment in exchange of a long-term contract with the customer are very active players. And in my opinion, this is what it's booming the market in the last year and making the big up to 5 megawatts plants across the country and making Brazil a more sunny country. Open to any questions, and thank you very much. Hello?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Pedro. Yeah. I think Rosa is now sharing the screen for Eduardo's presentation.
Perfect. If you want, and I can start introducing about GTIS before the slides. Yes, please. So GTIS Partners is a leading real estate private equity firm in the Americas. As a pioneer in its business field, GTIS ranks among the largest real estate private equity investors in Brazil and a leading diversified residential investors in the United States. GTIS also takes a local approach to investing with on-the-ground teams in 70 markets with 95 employees and 4.7 billion of gross real estate assets under management. With broad experience in structuring, design, development, and asset management, GTIS professionals oversees projects from concept to completion. GTIS Brazil infrastructure was established in 2018 to pursue the investment opportunities in Brazil in energy generation and transmission. We focus on renewable energy and technology infrastructure assets. Both segments benefit from the long-term structural demand drivers and a large investment gaps. Near-term growth in demand for energy for the economic recovery underway in Brazil, coupled with limited incumbent competition for public and private capital sources due to the recent economic and political dislocations, has created a compelling investment climate for players with both capital and operating expertise in the energy sector. Brazil developing technology infrastructure is supported by robust growth in e-commerce, resulting in rapidly increasing broadband penetration, creating long-term demand for data center, for example. GTIS fully integrated US-Brazil platforms provides industry-leading in-house sourcing, investment analysis, legal and regulatory review, development and asset management capability that are a key source of competitive advantage. And now I'm going to, after this preliminary introduction, I'd like to start my presentation with the first slide, is why now? And later I'm going to enter in more detail about Camila's questions and the challenge that I see here in Brazil. So why Brazil infrastructure now? Next slide, please. First, as I already said, we are facing here in Brazil, the economic recovery is driving infrastructure demand. So we see more demand for use of ports, roads, airports, energy consumption increasing. And together with all the limitations that the public sector has due to the severe fiscal crisis and all the limitation is constitutionally mandate government spending cap that's in place, doesn't allow the government to spend above a certain limit, create this compelling environmental for the private sector to invest. Also, if you add that it's the market-friendly reform that's underway in Brazil, all the privatizations, the concessions, the PPPs, the tax incentives, it's being used to attract foreign investors to the country. Together we see, and I'm going to explain later in more detail, about the growing corporate demand for free market using renewable power. And if we consider that Brazil has one of the most stable regulatory framework to invest in infrastructure, this creates these five factors that I just mentioned, create many reasons to decide for investors to decide to invest in the country. Next slide, please. So, energy and technology infrastructure comprise almost 65% of all the total investment needs in the next years until 2020. Basically, we see here in this chart that electricity is almost 40% of all the total investment. And together with telecommunication, we achieve this 65%. Next, please. Yeah, thank you. For every 1% of GDP growth in Brazil, the electricity consumption has been growing 1.5%. Even during the economic recession of the last years, the electrical consumption didn't reduce substantially, and with the economy recovery underway in Brazil, the demand for new projects are significant, big. In the next few years, due to the sustainable increase in the demand and taking in consideration the existing and contracted installed capacity, projects that are ready to build or under construction, in 2023, we could have energy shortage in the country, as you can see in this graph on the right. To avoid this situation, the government needs to structure new federal and regional auctions, such as these CEMIG auctions that Camila mentioned, and good volume has been negotiated through these regional auctions also. And mainly, the private sector must continue growing the free market, the corporate energy contracts. Next, please. And just to add one information, we believe that will be necessary for the next years around 140 billion investments for new projects is needed in these next 5 years to supply this shortage. And it's a global trend, as you can see on the left, that corporations are looking to acquire energy from renewable sources. It's more sustainable. The company are also looking for cost control, predictability on the cost and on the source, and it's much safer for their operation to manage their own energy. In Brazil, it's not different. Also take in consideration the increase in the energy price in the regulated market. The free market is growing, reaching this year around 30% of the 150 gigawatt of installed capacity. So we are talking here of a market already existing of 45 gigawatts on the free market. And as you can see on the right, this number is increasing since 2016. Next, please. Yes, we can change, please.
There's just a slight delay it'll be with you very shortly.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. Brazil's unbalanced energy matrix drives the need for wind and solar as the most sustainable sources. Hydropower comprises nearly 70% of the total generation, and it's a primary base load source of energy in Brazil. You can see on the left, which result in substantial weather-related risk, such as the 2014 and 15 drought, when electricity price surged over 50% in 5 hours, and the consumer experienced almost 20 hours without power. And this is more than 33% of higher than the regulatory limit. Wind and solar are very complementary to hydro, helps to reduce the spot price. As you can see on the right, you see that the spot price in the last year is increasing substantially, and the level of the reservoir are reducing. And if we considering that all the problems to obtain license for big, large hydro due to the environmental, indigenous, archaeological constraints, and the new projects, the last project that were built in Brazil of hydro, big hydro, large hydro, they don't have reservoir. We are also facing this problem and creating this risk. When we have, as you can see, please, the next slide, when we have timing of the year that we don't have water, we don't have rain, we have these dry seasons, we face this problem and increase the spot price. On the other hand, we will increase the wind generation. So it's extremely complementary between the renewables with the hydro generation. And with this migration and bringing more renewable projects to the grid, we believe that the energy matrix in Brazil will be much more balanced and much more predictable, the spot price in the future. Next, please. Wind and solar represent 70% of the total investment needed. During the next 8 years, wind energy will add at least 20 gigawatts of new projects. Currently, it's around 13 gigawatts. The growth for solar is even bigger. In the end of this year, we will have around 2 gigawatts of installed capacity. And in 8 years, we believe it will be at least 80 gigawatt in total. So we are talking about 4 times growth on the next years until 2026. And the total investment in both technologies is huge. It's around 100 billion reais, around $25 billion. The distribution generation that Pedro already mentioned has a great potential to grow. It started from almost zero to 3.5 gigawatts forecasted to 2026. And if we consider regions of the countries without connections, and the growth of electrical cars, battery storage, and the potential could be even more than that. And next, please. Yeah. Public sector will not be able to finance infrastructure needs due to the severe fiscal crisis and constitutional spending cap. 80% of the investments in infrastructure are financed or invested by public sector through direct investment. These 23% mainly municipalities, states, and federal government, or these 56%, it's the public companies such as Eletrobras, Petrobras, federal roads, and of course providing debt through BNDES and BNEB, for example. The government don't have resources to continue dominating infrastructure investments. 2016 comparing to 2015 already reduced in 68% the public disbursements, as you can see on the right. So who is providing that equity to infrastructure right now? The next slide, please. The private sector is starting to step into the investment needed. The infrastructure bonds are increasing and assuming an important role in the finance equation of the projects in Brazil. Bear in mind that the cost of debt in BNDES is moving until 2023 to a market conjunction through the TLP, and will be even a little bit more expensive than the infra bonds. The government is cutting all the subsidies in debt. And now I'd like to, this is my presentation, but I'd like just to start, Camila, to mention a little bit about some challenge that I see in the market, and then I leave to you, okay? So now talking in more detail about the challenge, in the free market, it's necessary to analyze carefully the credit quality of the counterpart of the PPAs. This is something that we already discussed today here. Also, it's very important to highlight the importance of understanding the necessities of the counterparty. Stable energy, complementary with other sources to compensate the seasonality effects. Trade energy companies also, I believe, can be very helpful to support developers to manage the relationship with the final consumer, manage also the regulatory aspects, equilibrate the supply with different technologies, and structure a protection due to the spot exposure that I mentioned earlier. To obtain bridge loan or long-term debt, the banks will make a detailed analysis of each specific PPA's contract and focus their analysis on the obligation from both parties, talking about the free market, guarantees, risks in case of low generation, and of course, the tenure. Everything will contribute to define the leverage and the debt cost. One of the challenges of the infra bonds is the maturity. On the average, infra bonds have a maturity period of 9 to 12 years, way below the BNDES or BNB finance conditions. Also, the infra bonds market is still very concentrated on individuals, in which represent 62% of the buyers. Because they are exempt of withholding tax, that's one of the reasons that the market grew a lot here in Brazil. And currently, we just have 1.7 to 2% of foreign investors acquiring this kind of bonds. So, and also the challenge, and this is the trend for the future, I see projects are combining both auctions and together with the free market. That's the main trend of the corporates, and that's the main trend of the companies that are investing in renewable here in Brazil. That's all. Thank you from my side.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Now we move on to the Q&A. We have a few minutes for questions. We already have some questions that people have been writing down. If all of you want to have a look at your GoToWebinar control panel, you can there is a slots there for questions. If you want to put your question there, we can address them here. I'll start with a question for Pedro Mateus from Faro. So Pedro, which are the 3 major selection factors for a PV project location?
Well, first of all, let me say sorry. I see some message saying that the line was bad. I hope that it is better now and people at least had the chance to understand a little bit of my presentation. Anyway, I think the 3 major factors for selecting a PV project location. First of all, and from my perspective of investor, the first point is a good counterparty from a credit perspective. There's no point on picking up a client that has no good credit perspective. At least from my business perspective, we won't move forward. Second, you should have a high energy price, which is in Brazil isn't very hard to find. And on the last, I would say that good radiation for solar is very important in order to make a very competitive price and bring savings, expressive savings for the customer.
Thank you, Pedro. Now a question for Eduardo specifically. Eduardo, why has utility scale solar been slower to scale up in Brazil compared to wind?
Yeah, one of the reasons is the long-term debt, because in Brazil, to have the debt from BNDES, the main bank that finances projects in the country, you need to have local content. They have several requirements. And currently, we just have 2 and coming for 3 solar industry companies with a local factory in the country. So basically, this creates a restriction of growth in the beginning of the business. Now we see a different trend and increasing significant, as I said, 4 times will be the increase on the solar installed capacity in the country due to, first, we see BNB, the Northeast Bank, are very active and look forward to do investing and to do the finance for solar. And now it's you see the leverage cost is extremely competitive. So if you take the total investment, total cost divided by the revenue is extremely competitive. The growth of solar is mainly because of the technology increase, efficiency increase, and reduction on cost. And together, we start to see different solutions to finance, not just on BNB, but through the bonds. Multilaterals are starting to give guarantees for bonds, also to starting to have funding to do the long-term debt in Brazil in reais. So then we are going to see a more compelling environmental for solar. But first, we need to bear in mind that when started wind in Brazil back in 2009, the first auction, solar was extremely more expensive. So now both sources are very similar in terms of competitiveness. And then we see now the introduction of new factors and new ways to finance.
Thank you, Eduardo. Just to complement Eduardo's answer, Brazil introduced wind in the auctions in 2009, but before in the PROINFA, the feed-in tariff, and solar was not allowed to participate back then. So that's also a very important reason. Solar was only included in the government in the auctions in 2014. We move on to another question now to Pedro. Pedro, about the new revision in the distributed generation legislation that's coming up next year, what are the impacts that we can expect?
Sorry, I was on mute. So there is several points in the revision and several. There's not a clear view on what are the impacts that we might expect. There is a version that says that the regulation will just change in order to start to monitor effectively for 1 more year or 2 more years what is the real impact of distributed generation over the grid and over the utilities. And there is another version that already says that there might be costs that should be paid by the by the distributed generators, either on a resi level or on a CNI level, having in mind that the virtual net metering projects already pay demand consumption costs, which are very high. Also, there is a potential point that Anel raised, which would be, should we cap or reduce the cap of 5 megawatts? That's a point that they raised on the last public consultancy. In my opinion, they should not. But they are also worried with the fact that there might be players that could go to the free market, and they are disguising themselves of doing projects on several 5 megawatt projects instead of doing a bigger project for the free market. And with that, theoretically, they get better prices on the DG instead of the free market. In that, in fact, Anel is concerned. I think the entire market is concerned, and that should be a point of discussion and a point of overview. But in the end, Camila, there is a huge list of discussions on the public consultancy of Anel for the regulation, which all the players, at least Faro, is very attentive and very responsive. And we will look forward for this discussion with Anel to support and to avoid killing the market on a potential regulation, on a potential revision of the regulation.
Thank you, Pedro. Now another one to Eduardo. To what extent does transmission infrastructure impact future development?
Sorry, could you repeat again?
To what extent does transmission infrastructure impact future development?
Yes, that's a very important question. In the beginning of the first auctions, what was not a priority for the government to invest prior to the auction in transmission. And that problem was a huge problem for investors, but was extremely mitigated because in the beginning you have all the revenue even without the main connection to the national grid. But this problem of connection, and considering that the projects are located in northeast of Brazil, the regions with the lowest condition of connections, the government started to increase a lot the number of auctions to transmission. And that's a very important factor now, because first, we are talking here about generation, but on transmission, there are a lot of auctions, are extremely competitive, many players are investing. So this is something that now many regions where we have radiation and we have a good wind resource, now it's coming to have more connection because the government is also doing the correct planning. They are planning first the connection where the projects are being developing. So this risk that we had in the past of having projects operational, you don't have as in the past. And now, for you to bid in the auction, in the regulated market, you must have the connection. So this is a mandatory. So when you go there, thinking on the tenor, the timing you have to be operational, everything takes in consideration the equation to the government allows you to go to the auction. So they just validate your presence in the auction if there is a connection. And so that's something that's extremely serious here in Brazil. And this is a very transparent form of working. Actually, if there are projects competing in the same region, first they will compete for connection. Then they will compete for the lowest PPA price.
Thank you, Eduardo. Rosa, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, sure.
What are the risks of the rollout to the free market?
Yeah, the risk that we have in the free market, first, as I was explaining, we need to be careful on the contraparties. You need to manage pretty well who you are going to sell the energy, how you are going to sell. You need to understand the demand of your contraparty and what kind of curve of energy, how you are going to mitigate your risk if you have some, for instance, this is a natural resource. So if you have a problem that for any reason you are not delivering the energy, what's the kind of consequence you have? How are you going to deliver the energy that you are not generating? How is the penalties on this contract? So this is important. The other factor is the bankability of this project. So this is something that BNDES is starting to work. Actually, they have already a model to do the leverage and the finance for that. So this is something that is starting right now, and that's a very good movement of BNDES. But the risk that you have is, first, you need to select very well your counterparty. Second, you need to manage the contract in a way that will be have benefits for both parties, who is buying the energy and who is selling the energy. It needs to be a very balanced contract. And third, you need to think always, how am I going to get the long-term debt with this contract, with this counterparty, and with this structure? So what I see, that the companies are doing the homework. We see an increase in this market. We see the corporations are willing to buy. Global companies have their internal obligation vision to invest in renewable. And in Brazil, as I was saying before, it's extremely competitive. So it's not just a question on investing in renewable source on the free market. It's I'm buying energy a very cost efficiency way.
Thank you, Eduardo. It's 11:02. Do we continue with the questions? We have quite a few here, or is that time up, Rosa and Eduardo?
I really need,
I think
I really need to leave, Camila.
Yes, I was going to say Pedro needs to go, and I'm very grateful to all of our panelists: Eduardo Klepacz, Managing Director, Head of Infrastructure Investments at GTIS, Pedro Mateus, CFO of Faro Energy, and of course, thank you so much, Camila Ramos, the Managing Director of CELA, Clean Energy Latin America. I've been really impressed by the input from our audience members as well. Thank you to all of you for such insightful questions. It's been a very fruitful discussion in what is a very exciting time for renewables in Brazil. I look forward to continuing the discussion with our panel BIREC. We'll see you all there. Today we have a special discount available for 20% for anyone wishing to attend BIREC, and that is available today only. So please do BIREC website, and you can use the discount code webinar20 to get your 20% discount today. And I hope to see you at BIREC from the 27th to the 29th of November in Sao Paulo. Thank you very much.